At this point, we usually have the really good question of, can we reuse this refrigerant once we recover it? And the answer is it depends. Let's go through the multiple different scenarios that entails. The law says that we can take refrigerant out of a customer's unit and reinstall it into the same exact unit or another unit by the same owner. So let me give some examples. If I take this tank and pick it up from the supply house and it's in a nice clean vacuum, there's no other refrigerant in here, and I have this system as R22, I can legally take the refrigerant out of this unit, put it in this recovery tank, and then legally when I'm done working, put that refrigerant back into this same exact unit. 100% allowed by law. Under another scenario, here's what I cannot legally do. If I have refrigerant here from Mrs. Jones' R22 and Tom's R22 and Samantha's R22, I have multiple different customers' refrigerant. Now I cannot take the refrigerant legally out of the system and put it into this tank because it's mixing with other customers' refrigerant and then try to put it back in. That I'm not allowed to do. Here's another scenario. I have a customer that has more than one unit. Maybe it's a very large house and they have 3 different air conditioners. Maybe it's a landlord or maybe it's a multi-family housing. I have this tank and there's no other refrigerant in this tank. I could take refrigerant out of every single unit that customer has, as long as it's the same refrigerant type, and put it into this tank. Then I can take this refrigerant out of the tank, regardless of how many units it came from, as long as it's the same owner, and put it back into another unit. For example, multifamily housing, I can take refrigerant from 4 or 5 different units. They all belong to the same owner, put them into this tank, and then on another unit, I could take refrigerant out of this tank and put it into another unit. Same exact owner. Here's a counter scenario. I have this unit that's overcharged, so take R22 out of this unit and put only R22 into this tank. And then I go to another customer that's overcharged, take refrigerant out of their unit, put it into this tank. And then I go to my third customer. My third customer, they need some refrigerant. So I cannot put refrigerant from this unit into their system. Even if it's for free, even if I'm not charging them or I'm charging them, regardless, it's not legally allowed to do that. So hopefully it gives you an idea behind the legalities of that, the same owner versus different owners. So we cannot mix refrigerants from different owners, and we certainly can't mix different types of refrigerant. Again, in this tank, I have R22, I can only put R22. This tank is labeled for R410A, in that case I can only put R410A. Now that we understand the legal aspects of taking refrigerant out of a unit and putting it back in, let's look at some practical aspects of it. For one, we don't know the condition of the last person that worked in the system. Maybe the installer, they didn't have a microengage. Maybe they weren't taught the right way. Maybe they were in a hurry. Maybe their boss was pushing them. Who knows all the different scenarios, but if they didn't pull a good vacuum, they would have left moisture inside the system. And that moisture is eating away the system as it runs. Now I'm doing work in the system, spending a lot of money, doing my best to do that job the right way, and I take that contaminated refrigerant out of the system, and then I put that contaminated refrigerant back into the system. Now I've undid all of that work and extra amount of time that I've spent making sure I did it right. So me personally, most of the time, I prefer to put new refrigerant back into that system just because the risk is high. Let's look at another aspect of that. Let's say the installer did his or her job correct. They did everything right. Now maybe the maintenance person comes along and they didn't purge their hoses. So every time they're checking refrigerant, they have multiple different refrigerants they're using, and now they're mixing a little bit of refrigerant. Or maybe there's air and contaminants or moisture. Now every time they're hooking their gauges up to that system, they're putting more and more contamination to that unit. Let's look at another scenario. Somebody else came along and they added refrigerant. And as they added refrigerant, they had contamination in their hoses or maybe some other type of refrigerant. And as they put new refrigerant into that system, they push or force those contaminants into that refrigeration system. So we've been harping on making sure we purge those lines, but maybe the last person didn't do all those steps. Now we have mixed refrigerants, and we don't know the condition of all the people that worked in that ahead of time. So as we take and do our job correct, and we strive to do their jobs the best as we can, we don't know the condition of everybody else. So even if you do your job correct and you take that refrigerant out and then you put that contaminated refrigerant back in, you're now causing, again, more and more problems. So in your best intentions, you're doing your job with a high skill, you're trying to do everything right, but you take that contaminated refrigerant out of the system and then you do all this work and you put that contaminated refrigerant back in the system, you haven't really gained anything. So while refrigerant does cost a lot of money, the labor, the time it takes doing that work is way more expensive than the refrigerant itself. Most of the time, I'm going to take and put in that system new refrigerant. Take the old refrigerant out, send it out to be recycled, reclaimed, and I'm going to take and put new refrigerant back into the system because I don't want to risk the chance of it. To give you an example, this tank I cut open only because it was out of hydro date by a long ways. I kept this tank and only used this tank for one purpose. I would take refrigerant out of a unit, put it into this tank. Then I was done working, I would take the refrigerant out of this tank and put it back into the unit. After every single service call, I would pull a good deep vacuum on this tank so it was ready to go for the next call. I only used this tank for taking refrigerant out and putting it back in, which I didn't do very often. So that tank was kept pure and clean. So even though the outside was beat up from years of life, the inside should have been in really good shape. So when I cut this tank open, I was really shocked to see the amount of rust inside of here. We can only have rust from two things: oxygen and also moisture. There's only two ways we can get oxygen and moisture into this tank, and that's either if the tank was leaking, which it was not, or all the contaminated refrigerants. So even though there's very few scenarios where I took refrigerant out of a unit, put that refrigerant back in, under those few scenarios, we know that that refrigerant was not in very good condition because that's what caused this tank to rust up. Also, at the very bottom of this tank, there was a lot of oil. As I recovered that refrigerant out of the unit, that oil would get trapped in the bottom. And if we see in the bottom, there's multiple different types of oil in there. And I was really shocked to see so many different types of oil, especially since this tank had only been used for R22, which means people have been putting different types of oil in. So there's different layers of oil in there. So now we're mixing oil on top of mixing refrigerants. So me personally, I like to avoid taking refrigerant out of the system and putting it back in. I still run it through a filter as I'm pulling it out, and I put it through a filter as I'm putting it back in, but it's still just not enough. Now, yes, there are going to be scenarios where you're going to do that, especially when the price of R22 is going higher and higher and higher. Especially when you get to big commercial systems. They're using a large quantity of refrigerant. You're going to want to have to clean and filter that refrigerant and put it back in. But when possible, most of the time, it's a really good idea to take that refrigerant out and then simply put new refrigerant back in its place to solve the issues of this contamination. And again, I was really shocked to see the condition of this tank inside. I expect it to be shiny and clean and looking good. So even though it may be legal to take refrigerant out of this unit, put it in this tank, and then return it back to that same unit, the risk factor is very high. The cost and the damage it's going to do to that unit is very high. Now, if you explain that to the customer and they're okay with taking that risk, then you can move forward, put that in writing. But I want you to understand that there is a high risk involved. There's still going to be scenarios where you're going to take the refrigerant out of the unit and put it back in. But as long as you understand the risk of doing that, even with the best intentions, doing it with the best possible way, you're going to still have contaminations. Contaminations from your hoses, contaminations from the recovery machine, and the contamination from all the people before you working in that system. So while it may be legal, it's still not always a good idea. But that's going to have to be a decision that you're going to have to make, and a decision between you and also your customer. So we discussed recovery, where we simply take the refrigerant out of the unit in any condition and store it in a recovery tank. And we also talked about reclaim. To process recovered refrigerant, at least the purity specified in the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute Standard 700-2016, and to verify its purity using an analytical methodology prescribed in the standard. Reclamation requires specialized machinery not available at a particular job site or an auto repair shop. This is where it's going to be put back to a factory standard. Now there's another category, and this category is called recycle. When referring to a refrigerant, recycle means to extract the refrigerant from an appliance, except a motor vehicle air conditioner, and clean the refrigerant for reuse in the equipment of the same owner without meeting all the requirements for reclamation. In general, recycled refrigerant is refrigerant that is cleaned using oil separation and single or multiple passes through devices such as replaceable core filter dryers, which reduce moisture, acidity, and particulate matter. So if you look at that definition, it pretty clearly states that it needs oil separation. We saw what the oil looked like in the bottom of these recovery tanks. Now, a lot of people call it recycling when they're taking refrigerant out of a system. They run it through a filter dryer and then put it through another filter dryer and then put it back in. Whatever the fine details are, I'm not too worried about. And what's a bigger concern for me is so many people now are mixing refrigerants, and they're also not pulling a good vacuum, leaving moisture in the system that turns into acids. These are big concerns. So nowadays, it's becoming more and more of a need to have a refrigerant analyzer. And this is a very special instrument that's going to check the purity of a refrigerant and also to check to see if refrigerants are mixed. This is good for multiple things. If I want to put that refrigerant back into the system, I can check to see if that refrigerant is in good shape first. Also, if I'm going to take that refrigerant and put it into a larger refrigerant tank to maybe sell that back to a reclaim company, then I want to check the purity of that refrigerant. And I also want to check to make sure the smaller tank I'm putting into that bigger tank isn't contaminated. If I have a contaminated small tank and I put it in the larger pure tank, it contaminates that whole larger tank. So having these refrigerant analyzers nowadays are becoming more and more of a need, especially when you come to some systems and you see that all of your numbers are completely off the wall, nothing matches. And instead of having to remove all the refrigerant and put it into a tank and check the temperature pressure, we can simply use this refrigerant analyzer and check the purity and the quality of that refrigerant without having to remove it all. So it's becoming more and more of a need. However, these tools are very expensive, and it's not your typical tool that an HVAC technician would have. It's usually a company provided tool, but as these tools become more and more needed, we may see a change in that. Refrigerant analyzer is something I think that most companies are going to start needing to have now. That way they can show the customer, hey, this refrigerant you have in here is not pure and clean refrigerant. It has a little printout that you can prove to them, hey, this is the data that we found from that. Now we need to recover all that refrigerant, pay to have it disposed of, and charge it the right way. So regardless of who you're working with, don't argue with anybody. I know that sometimes the manufacturers and people get the vocabulary of reclaim, recover, and recycle mixed up. On the EPA test, it is there very clearly defined. However, I even saw an installation manual that used the wrong vocabulary when referring to that. Most importantly, just don't do anything illegal, and please, please, please do not mix refrigerant. It only makes it harder on everybody else trying to do things the right way.